ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak in English because we have our eminent guests, and I suppose the discussion afterwards is going to be held in English. I'm trying a little bit like Andreas Michalsen made before to make a sort of Google Earth descent on the situation like I experienced it in the last 40 years. And I seem to discover some patterns that I would like to bring you to discussion. I try not to speak too quickly so that the translation doesn't have a burnout. So this very busy picture shows us a definition which I try to make evaluating along the years, and finally saying that fasting is the ability to live without absorbing food through the digestive system for a certain amount of time, letting the body cells burn the fat humans and animals keep as main energy storage in their adipose tissue. I think this is clear for everybody after the talks of this morning. Fasting triggers a switch in gene activation, and this is the merit of Walter Longo to have really showed us how, and in metabolic pathways. It activates the elimination of cell and molecular garbage and modulates immunity. This is the topic of autophagy. When humans fast willingly and according to a safe method, they can obtain a wide range of therapeutical effects. Fasting can also serve as vision quest and spiritual experience. This is, of course, very typical from our clinics and from the view that also the 𝗪𝘂𝗍𝗪𝗲𝗍 Heilfastenernährung had, and which I hope is not going to disappear, which I hope is going to stay in predominant position, even if the research tends always to simplify the models. And I don't think fasting is a simple happening, it's a complex. And I will try to give you an idea how I see the things. And I will try also to reflect about the evolution in the research and the positive, what research is bringing us, the ground on which we can grow and probably be always more individual and more precise in the way we use fasting for several diseases or for several conditions, and at the same time not let fasting mimicking diets, fasting mimicking pills, the whole world of fasting mimicking, just say mimicking is much better than the real thing, which would be for me not what I hope. But at the same time, we cannot just close and say no, because the research has led to this mimicking world, and at the same time had brought us extremely important progresses, improving and new knowledge. So first, the second diapositive is a little reverence to our Maria Buchinger Foundation prize winner from last year. Next year, or should I do it myself, apparently? I know, okay. Fasting is a strong stimulation of the human self-healing mechanism at body as well as at soul level. And this is Heinz Warner, our long-time chief doctor in the clinic. So you see, also when you look at the books from Otto Buchinger and some old pioneers of fasting, you see incredible truths, but we didn't know how, were the mechanism behind the truth. And now, thank the word of this very develop research at international level, we understand better the mechanism, even the genetic mechanism, beyond the clinical effects that we think knowing well. And just to go from Google Earth from the most generalized, it's clear that fasting is the ability that allowed animals and humans to go through, to live on a planet which is characterized by the discontinuity in food supply. During the winter, during the dry season, monsoon, or during a lot of other climatic situations or private situations, there is no food, so you have to make reserves and be able to use the reserve when it's necessary. And we saw in animal models, especially the ones living free in the nature, how sophisticated and how extraordinary this mechanism are with incredibly little resources. And just to tell you that in the 90s there was a lot of research about weight cycling, and it was shown, especially by Prentice, that you have a weight cycling, a totally natural weight cycling, coming always to baseline when you consider humans living under natural conditions or free living animals who make spontaneous fasting. And this is always the summary I do. So when you have a lot of food to your disposal, you're programmed to eat a lot and make storage. Because in nature, there was always a time where there was less to eat, so less food, when less sunshine, and then the storages came to give you the energy you need to live and to restore your minimal structures. And also we've shown today that this has an extraordinary therapeutic effects on many. And it's just for the pleasure of showing these pictures, which come always from 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗵 and his team. These are the history of animals, and this is why in the 𝗃𝗂𝗍 I always try to bring the animals living free, because this is a good proof for us and a good model for us how fasting is a totally natural mechanism, and it's probably much more natural to fast regularly than not to fast. And I repeat, the Cahill model, 40 days is what a normal person, standard person has in reserves, and of course in the moment where you put on weight you have more reserves. The three phases of 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗵 are, for me, also very interesting. We have the first phase is glycogen and the first fat utilization. At the beginning, you still have about 30–25% of proteins utilized, and then we see this mechanism bringing the protein utilization to a minimum, and this can last a long time according to our fat reserves. And then you have this phase 3 he mentioned. We never see in our clinics because we never come to a full exhaustion of fat. We never reach that threshold. But the phase 3 would be the phase of extremely accelerated catabolism, forcing the animals to refeed. And I just make a parenthesis. If you know the old literature, probably Dr. Lützner will know that they always speak about the real hunger, which should be totally different from the feeling of having a sort of appetite of something during the fasting. It's something which pushed you to eat, but we never saw that in our clinics. We will come never to that point. And maybe to come back, what is fasting? It's always the question. There is case reports of people who have fasted lifelong, or they didn't eat except, like Therese von Kovner-Reuth, just the host. And these people have been really put under control. And it's always saints or mysticals who have a very strong spiritual dimension. This is the patron of Switzerland, Nicolaus von der Flue. And he said, not having eaten from the age 35, more or less. You see the way he looks like. It's more convincing when you see people claiming they don't eat and they are nicely round, which you always think, but he might have at least. And you have this guy who is Prahlad Jani. He's supposed to have been observed in an Austrian clinic and really monitored. He didn't eliminate anything, and he apparently, since the age of 6, didn't eat anything after having had an apparition of a goddess who told him apparently not to eat anymore. So it's always linked to very strong spiritual dimension. And you know, I am prone not to make this ridiculous, because what we do is so much made ridiculous by people who never have the idea that fasting was possible, so that I just put that in the room. It is probably in extreme situation with a high spirituality, something we cannot exclude. And Otto Buchinger visited Therese von Konnersreuth, and he said, as conclusion to his visit, nutritio spiritualis. Water fasting is what we know as total fast, and as we see before, and in the Bible, the people don't eat and don't drink. It's expresses verbis said. But water fasting is probably what we could call the original. And for us, and it's not very modest, but I just would say that the person and the method who is as near as possible as what I would say is an original traditional fasting method is the one of Otto Buchinger. It started by an oral experience. He cured his polyarthritis after a streptococcal infection. And then he made a method, and he had a comprehension of fasting, which is, in my opinion, not because it's our method, but I think it's the more complete, the more holistic, if this word was still possible to use. And he wrote things that we still can consider as valid today. Of course, he didn't understand how this was working. And what I want to retain here is that really these 3 dimensions in our comprehension of fasting are fundamental. The medical dimension is clear. The community dimension, it's suggested in the talk of Yvon Le Mao by this huddling. Actually, they survive only because they have a community, and this community, one single penguin would never survive. So the community is part of the fasting, and the spiritual dimension might have much more importance as many think, but of course this complexity, it makes it difficult to study. And medical dimension, I just show you some pictures. This is a tradition in our clinics, and also a very big staff of nurses, and this nutrition and health education part, physiotherapy, which is made more easy because you have a diminution of the inflammation, exactly like the motivation of the people is enhanced by the fasting, so you can bring them better behavioral changes, make them feel like they do want to have them, and rediscovering the pleasure of exercise. And of course, all the synergistic working therapies you can imagine to fit to any individual situation. Psychotherapy and mind-body, and even in a clinic, you can have culture, creativity, and spiritual, and we would say today maybe global ethics, because we are in a global society. And we don't do short things, we just do the things like I think they should be done with, for instance, 10-day programs, it's 6 days of fasting, and then a refeeding period. And the regeneration period during the refeeding phase is, for me, now documented by everything we heard before. The same if you do 14 days, always a period of transition at the beginning, at the end, and even if you do more time. And like we try in a clinic which didn't have a vocation of being a research department. We try now really since 3 years very active to use all this experimental situation we have with 5,000 persons a year, and made a big observational study together with Charité and Andreas Michelsen. And this is together with Yvon Lemao and Stéphane Blanc and the CNRS in Strasbourg. From these 16 persons, I will show you some of the first results. But of course, like always, when it's not published and not really analyzed, then we prefer just wait for the next Congress to show you the whole. Some are here in the 3 of these participants to this study, 16 young, more or less young men in good health, Buchinger Wilhelmi, Freddy Hanschke, and Philipp Kleine. There's here and Beate Congress. And just to show you the results on weight, which are evident, we have a very significant results always when we consider weight and even in the refeeding period. And the waist, which is showing that the weight is lost at the right place, is also diminishing in an extremely significant proportions. I don't show you the results on the almost 2,000 persons that we also analyzed because they are more difficult to analyze, and this was an homogeneous group who we invited and who stayed almost for 3 weeks. Triglycerides is just anecdotal, just to show you how the things really go back to normal. And I would like just to stress the importance which fasting has in a society, in a medical society like ours. It's extend health span, and in that field we are conform with the research of today. But it's also empowerment. We don't depend on a drug, we depend on ourselves. Consciousness enlargement is more the spiritual dimension, and finding back to physical exercise, I think this is also something everybody recommends in a certain way. Stress reduction and enhancement of communication between people and with oneself. And this means the leverage, and I just insist on that point and then I take it for granted. We have a lot of caring health professionals, scientific documentation, all-round care, a protected place, nature, soul food, calmness, everything is individual, and organic fresh food and supplement. It represents an interruption of all behavior patterns. And we can use the time for lifestyle education. Of course, this has a price, and this is where new models are emerging, which take only part of it, but give it for a more affordable price. And all these tries are legitimate. We are going to make a sort of review on that. In our clinics, metabolic diseases and chronic inflammatory diseases are the diseases we treat normally, and we are highly interested now in the research showing cancer, epilepsy, Parkinson, Alzheimer. These are things, and multiple sclerosis, we had some cases, but of course we didn't know exactly how to treat them, and this is a big hope that research is going maybe to adapt fasting to all these situations. And our method is resumed in these fasting guidelines, which are being published in 2013. Now, this was, in my opinion, immodestly, like I said, the original. This is really the all-round thing. Now, supplementation. This is something I really experienced on my own. First, in the Buchinger Wilhelmi program, we have a supplementation. And this is a quarter liter of juice and a soup and some honey. It's a carb supplementation, doesn't prevent the positive effects to come, like I will show you. And it's made to make the transition softer and give the person something to join around a table. This was probably empirically done by Buchinger. And now I would like to confront you with what we experienced, myself and also my husband. when the obesity treatment started to use fasting, or they called it zero-calorie diet. And zero-calorie diet was what they call also a total fasting. It was water fasting for extremely long periods. The goal was waist circumference diminution. And since obesity was not considered like as a condition, they decided, of course, to claim, and with right, that they wanted to treat the obesity-associated diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular diseases. No question about inflammatory diseases. So the leverages were nutrition, exercise, and temperature. And this is really a period I know very well because it's the period I started to go to the international congresses on obesity and national and Europeans. And at the beginning it was extremely interesting and I learned a lot about fasting. But then a big bang happened. There was suddenly someone noticed the nitrogen balance, they get negative. So you utilize part of the proteins. And nobody was interested what happens afterwards. Of course, they turn positive afterwards, and maybe this is part of the sensational regeneration process that fasting might conceal. But they said it's very bad, and of course you have to neutralize this horrible depletion of proteins because your muscles are going to melt, and we all know that, and then develop the protein-modified fasting. So this is the nitrogen balance, and really this is almost the only reason why the protein diets were invented, is just to try to diminish, but you never can abolish the negative balance, even if you give 100 grams of proteins per day. So here it's a model with ModiFast giving 133 grams of protein and trying to make this negativity less negative without considering that afterwards you have a rebuild. So the dietary intervention were the first topics. Then the commercial formulas came. There was the protein-modified fasting. And then, parallel to all that, you have always the people who think, well, why do you care about doing all these horrible diets and making this horrible exercise when you could take a pill and have no problems? And this is what I'm going just to take under the loop now. Buchinger fasting was in the 30s. Then the water fasting started in the 50s, 60s. More or less after war, probably the people had a boom on weight because they had suffered so long, and now they had food and they started to get obese. And here is an example of one of many publications showing extremely long periods of fasting by extreme obesity. Here it's 249 days, but the next will show you what was possible. This guy fasted 392 days on water fasting. This is the result. This is also a publication. And of course, nothing prepared the people to stay slim. They were really not informed about what to do, and it was extremely expensive. The people were put in hospitals, and you know the price of a day in a hospital. So they decided we make it ambulant. And parallel, there was still another thing. This is the protein-sparing fast from Blackburn, especially in the 70s. And this is pure protein, pure protein. For instance, 410 grams of beef a day, meat, fish, eggs, some vegetables with very little carbs and very little fat. So pure protein. And this is for me very interesting because let's say 25 years after that, or 40 years afterward, you say exactly that this is very dangerous as far as aging. This is why Walter Longo, who says, you should always have a longevity specialist by any new discovery, because on the short term it might help, but you die young. So this is true. This led to a lot of cardiovascular diseases, gout, elevated cholesterol. Now let us have a see at the first protein formula was not made properly. It was a collagen substance, very bad biological protein. And this was called, ironically, the last chance diet. And 60% obese, still obese, died from myofibrillar cardiac dysfunction. So acute heart stop. And then, of course, in the congresses, you heard the specialists saying, fasting can lead to death. But it was a bad formula who led to death. And then it started organizing. You had the very low-calorie diets. And Modifast was the first one was developed in Ulm, maybe you know from Professor Ditsunai, together with Wander at that time, before it turned to be Sandoz, Wander, and then Novartis today. And there were recommendations made that you should, with a VLCD, very low-calorie diet, provide minimum 400, 500 calories a day, and then 40, 50 grams of biological adequate protein. These were the recommendations for manufacturers. And then you had the low-calorie diets, because, for instance, the OptiFast program, which still exists today, developed a diet with 100 grams of proteins a day and about 1,000 plus calories. This is the moment where I stopped going to the congresses, because at that place, the people who didn't use very low-calorie diets or some kinds of these programs, they were just ignorance. And all the studies were done only with these products. And for me, it was not so much interesting anymore. And I just stressed that, so that I hope in this new generation of researchers is not going to happen, and we will be more clever than that. The magic bullets is for me something fascinating. Who can be interested in something like this? Probably only industries. The first anorexic drugs stop feeling hungry, although the people don't eat because they are hungry, they eat because it's sweet and because it's fat. But you had first anorexigen drugs, but they produced, for instance, dexfenfluramine. They produced mortal pulmonary hypertension. So this is not used so much anymore. And then you had the fat absorption inhibitors. I experienced that when it came out, Xenical, Orlistat, and I thought, in which ill spirit can come the idea that you should eat and you can eliminate by the intestine the fat so that you don't get fat, when half of the planet is starving. But this didn't work really, because the people had steatorrhea, but it's still sold today with the recommendation you shouldn't eat too much fat at the same time. And the uncoupling protein, this is the idea that you could use some of the energy, of the food energy, transform it into heat. So practically, we would be like in a sauna so that we don't put on weight. Yeah, this could be interesting for people like me who freeze all the time, but it still doesn't work really well because it has too much side effects. So this is what I experienced in the last since the 80s, where I went to the congresses, and my interest started again before it was called Mimicked, when we heard about the studies of Walter and also of Madsen and people who really came from the longevity level. This was totally new for me, because until now it's always organ-oriented. stomach or the GI or the joints or anything. But now we had longevity, and he was putting the thing in a light which for me was much more similar to what I think is right. And we had the idea of slowing down aging process, enlarging health span, yes. And then, of course, like aging is not considered as a condition against the research, and the researchers and the people who try to enhance longevity, they do that through stressing that when you push back the time where you are healthy, a lot of diseases which community should pay for doesn't appear or appear much later. This is why diabetes, even cancer, came on the floor, and that was for us, we were all tetanized, it was extraordinary. And then new parameters where we never heard about, of course, diminishing insulin, okay, this we could understand, diminishing glucose, that was also understandable, but IGF-1, no one had heard, we never talked about IGF-1, and the ketone bodies were something where we were not sure, is it good or is it bad, or should I? So now the longevity brings new parameters where we can try to consider our work. And they propose a calorie restriction, 30% by no malnutrition, or now the fasting models with low protein, but vegetable proteins, very low carbs, but high carbs. Maybe Walter can correct this, probably is not totally right, but high fat. And now they say animal protein and carb, and especially not complex carb, but the other ones, speed aging. And this is really interesting. Now you have another view on the protein diets. And exercise was also, is also thematized in the longevity field. Now, if you take the dietary intervention, we had from Andreas Michalsen a little review today, so I'm not interested. I bring our Buchinger Wilhelmi program as a periodic fasting, and I think this new vocabulary is very practical to understand these different patterns of fasting we have today. And just to say, now we have the results for glucose, and effectively glucose is, even when the glucose is normal, is reduced, but never under the norm, or in just, and if we take the pictures of the 2,000 persons we have in our big study, it's exactly the same. So you reduce glucose to a baseline, and you don't go down under in the hypoglycemia. And ketone bodies, so we are even if we give some little amounts of sugar. And going back to our classification, calorie restriction, we heard that's just 30% less, but a good diet. This is Mattsson's favorite, I think. Intermittent fasting has several patterns, and alternate fast days and 5-2. We see many of these, not alternate fast day, I never saw that, but 5-2 is similar to some religious proposals. And time-restricted fasting is very interesting, and I think this is something everybody from us can experience and see how well you feel when you make a long pause without food. Time-restricted fasting, so you may probably read about Ramadan, because we are in the Ramadan month. If you go on internet, they really are taking the floor with their fasting. Although for many people who do the Ramadan, it's nice if you don't take pictures, but we find that all in internet. The people eat during the night, so it's not a fasting, it's a time-restricted fasting, and sometimes they eat so much that they have really problems, and they come to our clinic afterwards saying, oh, I kept my weight a long time, but then came the Ramadan, and of course, I put on weight again. But you see, it's a whole principle. It's not just no food or time-restricted food, but it's a lot of moral and other attitudes you should have. So when we come to the fasting mimicking diets, of course, we find Walter Longo back, and this company he founded, which is also had the advantage that it's real food. Even if it's packaged, it's not a sort of a glue with a strawberry aroma, but it's trying to have normal food in a practical way. The question is just, for me, is not that if this has a justification or not. I think many people prefer having packaged things and know what they have to do every day. What makes me, what I hope is that we still are going to study fasting and saying, okay, and if you cannot do the real thing, in my opinion, then you have a lot of other possibilities which are then not with fresh food, but the way it makes it more practical. So at least that we let, it's a bit like by breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is recognized to be the most natural thing. And if you cannot breastfeed, you're very happy that you have formulas. And in special cases for diseases, then I think this is the future. Or at least the development of fasting mimicking diets might give us the research we need to just convince people that they have this ability of fasting. So I really hope we find the right way to collaborate in the future. And now I just tell you something about the magic bullets which are developed today with such an incredible amount of money that I just think, okay, we have seen a lot of fakes and incredible things happening the last year, but this is, for me, sometimes just unbelievable. The first one is NR or NAD, nicotine riboside, and this is a precursor of the molecule nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NAD. I'm sorry for the translators. This molecule protects against DNA damage, making it a favorite among the anti-aging pills. Levels of NAD diminish with age, and fasting is a way to replenish them. NR is also produced by a chemical company called Chromadex under the name of Niagen. And this is retailed by companies like Elysium Health, which is a big company in America, and very well-known scientists are implicated, like 𝗕𝘂𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵 from MIT, Nobel Prize winners, and they really think you can rejuvenate and you can mimic the fasting with this. This we go on. And then the autophagy boost. So, you know, one problem that occurs in many aging-related chronic conditions, whether it's diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or Alzheimer, is the buildup of protein in affected tissues. And you can remove those proteins spontaneously through the process of autophagy. But autophagy functions better when you are in low-level calories and with a certain feeding, and of course also with fasting. So fasting is very powerful at removing this cell and molecular garbage. And there is one substance called rapamycin, but other ones are under study now to try to stimulate the autophagy. So why do it simple when you can make it complicated? This is my approach, but it's not everybody wants. And then the next one is the AMPK activators of a substance like metformin, for instance, who stimulates the autophagy and also the increased NAD. And at the end, my favorite, ketone bodies. You know, ketone bodies come when you eat in a certain way, and especially you limit the calories and the carbs. Now, what happens? You can buy it and be immediately like the person left or right. And the interesting thing about that is it tastes like gasoline, so it's difficult to sell. And now, this is a fasting mimicking pill, and they try to find a ketone mimicking molecule who has a better taste so that you can mimic the fasting. So 2 levels of mimicking. And this is probably where you stop and you go back to now the what Madsen says, saying fasting is perfectly safe, whereas I always have concerns about taking a drug. The thing with fasting is that nobody makes any money off it. That's why you have companies saying they can mimic some or all the beneficial effect of fasting. And I repeat, this is for the drugs. For the fasting mimicking diets, I have a much more differentiated attitude. And in our opinion, fasting is the simplest and cheapest way to improve your health, but why get the benefit for free if you can pay for them? But this is a provocation. I must yet now say we have a little experience in research. We are still at the beginning, and we can only do that in partnership with universities and big research groups. And it's extremely expensive. So if you don't create markets for healthy things, we are going to stay a bunch of idealists and persuaded people. So I think through the dialogue with the people developing manufactured products and staying in a sort of sensitive place where you say, okay, maybe there is a holistic way of doing it, but it's expensive, it's not for everyone. We can do simpler things, like also the 7 days fasting for healthy was the first try in that direction. I hope we go on with the dialogue, and so my conclusion is fasting in the field of longevity and fasting. Of course, I think what we do is still good. Intermittent fasting, time-restricted fasting is something everybody can do, and the fasting mimicking diets with a lot of research and maybe more specificity could be for us a big help in the future. I thank you very much for your attention. This is maybe a sort of a little personal advice or pray for you, Walter. It's okay to say my product is good, but the problem is from a lifestyle perspective, are a few healthy years later in life worth feeling miserable a few days every month. Feeling miserable. That is the way fasting is documented, to say my pill is much better because you're not feeling miserable, you're as happy as every day. But I just showed you the scores of our 2,000 people when they were asked every daily feeling emotionally and physically. And this is what you say. On a visual scale from 0 to 10, it doesn't seem that they are very unhappy.